Muy buenas, muy buenas. Muy buenos días a todos. Vamos a dar inicio en 3 minutos. Tenemos además señal de streaming, pero a quienes han venido aquí personalmente, físicamente, eso es de gran valor. De manera que les voy a invitar a que reclamen, al que lo necesite, los auriculares para la traducción simultánea si así lo requieren, porque enseguida que demos inicio vamos a continuar con la primera invitada, que es Sass Brown, y la conversación va a ser en inglés. Los auriculares están al final de este espacio a la izquierda. Allá los pueden reclamar. Si lo van a hacer, háganlo de una vez y así estamos todos listos para arrancar. Gracias. Ahora sí que vamos a empezar. Y vamos a empezar en lenguaje de moda. Esto es un poco singular, el hecho de inaugurar lo que llamamos el escenario de conocimiento compartido desde este marco titulado Bogotá Fashion Week 2024. Pero es que este marco da acceso al backstage. Y como los maniquíes, el backstage es donde sucede la verdadera operación de la moda en sentido literal, en sentido metafórico. María Paz Gaviria, qué gusto. Caminemos por esta suerte de pasarela que se va a poner en marcha. De hecho, esta tarde, a partir de las 5 de la tarde, por este escenario, por este tapete negro, van a ocurrir los desfiles independientes. Pero mientras tanto, este es el espacio de conversaciones BFW que estamos inaugurando. Muchas gracias por asistir a esta 7ª edición. María Paz estaba recordando esta mañana, si quieres acompañarme aquí además, porque en streaming vamos a saludar también a toda la audiencia, y estaba recordando cómo en 2017 la Cámara de Comercio de Bogotá toma la gran decisión de entregarle una plataforma a la ciudad, cómo en 2018 se creó el espacio de conversaciones BFW para justamente poner en diálogo a la moda con un conocimiento interdisciplinar, intersectorial. El sector de la moda se puede poner en comunicación con cualquier sector de la economía y lo vamos a comprobar aquí en vivo con todos nuestros acompañantes. Todo eso estaba recordando esta mañana. Estoy segura que después de la gran inauguración de anoche, te felicito, con Olga Piedrahita en el Teatro Julio Mario, no has debido dormir tampoco mucho y seguramente pensando también en este momento de vernos juntas.
Rosy, son de esas noches que la energía es tan eléctrica, donde se consigue esa multidisciplinaridad de la moda, que vemos tan particularmente marcada tanto anoche, donde no fue solo una noche de moda, sino que se avivaron las prendas, donde se avivó la expresión a través también de la danza. Hablabas de esa apuesta hace 7 años de la Cámara, que tuvo esa visión de que la moda precisamente es algo que atraviesa todos los aspectos de nuestras vidas. No solo es una industria fundamental, no solo a nivel económico, que genera identidad, que genera tejido, que tiene procesos políticos y sociales, procesos de expresión. Y también tiene razón. Anoche, al acostarme, pensaba en este momento. Este es mi primer momento oficial de inauguración al público del Bogotá Fashion Week. Un honor estar otra vez a tu lado con la SillaVerde. Nuestros 82 invitados que atraviesan todos los aspectos de la vida. Hablaba de ese carácter que tú siempre has expresado, pero creo que has llevado a un nivel que honra al Bogotá Fashion Week, así que estamos absolutamente emocionados de recibirlos hoy. Muy emocionados así de temprano, ver un auditorio lleno de personas. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Este es un espacio abierto, gratuito, para la reflexión, para el aprendimiento. Muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Bueno, y no se diga que todos tenemos un lado fetiche, estoy segura. Nosotras, no mencionemos marcas, porque siempre le apostamos a la moda colombiana. Tú siempre combinas, además de una manera muy singular, con mucha personalidad, toda esta apuesta por la moda nacional. Pero les digo que cuando uno desea que las cosas vayan bien es donde uno recurre a los fetiches, ¿cierto? Yo en homenaje a Olga Piedrahita, que es la única marca que voy a mencionar porque se merece todo, la gran diseñadora de hace 35 años, gracias por ese aplauso, por Olga Piedrahita, por un inmenso trabajo. Esta falda que me la hizo de manera bien especial, hablando de bordar con las palabras, el bordar con el hilo y el bordar con las palabras, que es más el oficio que he elegido, pero sin duda una falda de la suerte. Ya he perdido la cuenta las veces que me la he puesto y menciono este detalle porque Conversaciones BFW ocurre con un foco. El foco está puesto en la moda buena y justa, pero lo de la moda justa nació de este ensayo. Marta Rieso, una investigadora española, y les voy a leer un pequeño párrafo que da foco a todo lo que se van a encontrar en Conversaciones BFW. Dice ella que el tercer reto, porque habla de dos muy importantes para la moda, para que sea sostenible. Dice que el tercer reto es la tierra y dice: los excesos de la moda recaen en dos lugares muy concretos de nuestra casa, los suelos y los océanos. La Corte Penal Internacional está estudiando la incorporación de un nuevo delito, el ecocidio, que comprende actividades de imprudencia temeraria perpetradas a sabiendas de que causan daños graves, extensos y duraderos en el medio ambiente. La salud del hombre y la salud de la tierra no caminan en paralelo, son la misma cosa. Me permito terminar con esa frase: el hombre y la tierra, la mujer y la tierra, la mujer y el suelo, somos la misma cosa. Porque hemos invitado a María Paz para esta inauguración que ocurre en Colombia. Si ocurriera de pronto en un país en África, en un país en Europa, no recurriríamos a nuestra historia, pero estamos en Colombia. Y los ancestros, las comunidades artesanas tan involucradas, por fortuna hoy en día en la moda, y con quienes trabajamos mancomunadamente, son compañeros indispensables de este viaje. Entonces hemos invitado a ti, Juneikum Jamioy. Por favor, un aplauso, démosle la bienvenida. Bienvenida. Yuina, la llaman en casa, aunque su nombre, tan bello, Ati Juneikum, significa madre del primer rayo del sol. Eso me lo contó su papá, que es el gran poeta colombiano Hugo Jamioy. Lo más increíble es que con Yuina, que nos conocemos hace tiempo, estábamos recordando cuando eras chiquita y hoy eres una mujer de 20 años, que además, no sé si quieres compartir con el público qué estás estudiando.
Bueno, estoy estudiando diseño en la Universidad de los Andes. Ya voy por tercer semestre, entonces.
Es muy significativo. Yuina está estudiando diseño en la Universidad de los Andes, gracias además al apoyo de varias entidades. Yuina tiene la fortuna de ser fruto de una mistura cultural que no es tan frecuente en Colombia en el sentido de la mistura étnica. Tu mamá es aruaca, de la sierra, y tu papá es camchá, del Putumayo. ¿Tú dónde finalmente quedas? En la mitad.
Bueno,
por eso naciste en Manizales.
Probablemente. Bueno, nosotros familiarmente tenemos como una palabra para definirnos, como es Cantucua. Cantucua es Kamsha por mi papá y Tucua por Bintucua, que es el nombre tradicional del pueblo Iku, del pueblo arhuaco. Entonces no me siento ni más de allá ni más de acá, me siento de ambos.
Hablamos con Yuina, ¿no, María Paz? Que es que su vestuario refleja esa mistura de la que está hablando, porque vistes siempre la manta aruaca, pero con los detalles kamsha, que eso es un capricho tuyo.
Más de mi papá, más de mi papá un poquito, pero sí, como que siempre hemos tratado como en mi familia de estar siempre como mezclando todo, como que siempre estamos, a pesar de que crecí en la sierra, siempre he estado muy presente, tanto el tejido como la palabra en kamsha, prácticas, cosmogonía, todo. Entonces, sí, una muestra de eso es el vestido que traigo hoy.
Porque la moda nos manifiesta. Voy a dejar que desde el tutu, que es la mochila aruaca, puedas sacar tu celular, porque Yuina es una mujer pues, del siglo XXI, ¿no? Porque compartiendo con Hugo Jamio y María Paz, a propósito de la importancia de la palabra, del poder que otorga el hilar los pensamientos, que de eso sabe mucho tanto la comunidad kamsha, la comunidad aruaca, todas las comunidades colombianas, pero en particular Hugo porque es poeta. Le pedí algo de su tiempo y nos escribió un texto muy especial, ligado con esta reflexión que les leía. Mujeres y hombres con el suelo, con el planeta, somos una misma cosa. Por eso nos tenemos que cuidar. ¿Nos lo puedes compartir?
Sí. Bueno, este es un texto que hicimos en conjunto, un poco desde mi experiencia. Entonces, es más o menos así. Raíces ancestrales somos. Oí decir a mi abuelo, quien le mandó a mi padre en el tiempo que nos acompañó en este mundo, lo que somos desde las raíces en nuestro camino. Hoy no puedo decir otra cosa diferente a lo que mi abuelita aún nos repite. No olvides los símbolos antiguos, con ellos se teje la vida. Soy la hija de dos grandes culturas que hoy sobreviven al paso del tiempo por mi madre, soy Iku o Arhuaca, descendiente de los Taironas, guardianes del universo desde el corazón del mundo. Y también soy kamsha, por parte de mi padre, sanadores del mundo con la planta del yaje desde el pulmón del mundo, en el valle de Sibundo y Putumayo. Ahora que camino distante de los lugares donde aprendí las primeras palabras y puntadas junto a mis padres y abuelos, mi espíritu no está huérfano. Siento la fuerza de los símbolos del tutu y del shrumbiach. Tutu significa pensamiento de mujer en lengua iku, que es lo que normalmente en español llamamos mochila aruaca. Y shrumbiach representa el ombligo que conecta nuestro espíritu con la madre tierra, en el cinturón que tejen nuestras abuelas. Recuerdo a mi abuelita pedaleando una máquina de coser, confeccionando las mantas para nuestra gran fiesta del Betskanate, llena de bondad. Nos atavió a mis primos, a mis hermanitos y a mí. Fue una siembra espiritual. Desde entonces, el cumpleaños de mis hermanitos se convirtió en un motivo de inspiración para vestirnos con lo que yo aprendí.
Estamos hablando de mamá pastora, tiene 87 años y vive en el municipio de Sibundoy, en el departamento del Putumayo, en el valle del Sibundoy, y es una mujer hermosa y muy trabajadora, no para. Hable honra y sigamos leyendo.
Ahora estoy aquí llena de los símbolos de la vida y de la energía espiritual de dos territorios que llevo en mi corazón. Esta oportunidad de estudiar diseño en la Universidad de los Andes no podría ser cierta sin los símbolos aprendidos y el apoyo que me brinda Global Education y claramente el conocimiento adquirido por mis abuelos y mis padres. Tejer la vida con los símbolos antiguos sin olvidar mis raíces. Ese es mi camino. Y en estos caminos hechos para encontrarnos, como dice mi padre, muy pronto ofreceré la inspiración que nace de los símbolos antiguos, raíces que a diario recuerdan mi camino. Por ahora quiero compartir con ustedes el saludo que desde la sierra Nevada de Gonavindúa envía a mi padre a través de su poesía, cumpliendo con el mandato del Hawayenan, que significa sembrar la palabra en el corazón. Entonces, uno de sus poemas, que es tal vez uno de sus favoritos, En la tierra. No es que esté obligando a mi hijo a trabajos forzados en la tierra, solamente le estoy enseñando a consentir a su madre desde pequeño.
La voz de Hugo Jamioy es reconocidísima, ha estado presente en todos los encuentros de lenguas indígenas organizados por la Feria del Libro de Bogotá, en numerosos encuentros internacionales. Hugo Jamioy además se ha tomado la molestia de no solamente expresarse en lengua kamsha, su lengua materna, por escrito, oral, sino también de él mismo hacer la traducción al español. Sus obras nos han marcado a muchas generaciones, nos han hecho pensar y, como dice él, nos han hecho actuar. Escuchen el que sigue.
Bueno, decía, este es personalmente, después del que me escribió a mí y a mi hermana, uno de mis favoritos. No todos los lugares. Solo quiero decirte, hijo de mi vida, que no todos los lugares son tuyos, pero cada uno de ellos guarda algo para ti. Aquí personalmente no solamente lo tomo como hablar de lugares en el espacio, sino también de momentos, situaciones, personas que tal vez en cierto punto o en el momento en el que está pasando algo no entendemos el por qué, pero siempre nos llevamos algo enriquecedor que nutre el espíritu. Bonito debes pensar. Bonito debes pensar. Luego bonito debes hablar. Ahora ya mismo, bonita empieza a ser.
Eso, María Paz, creo que es uno de sus favoritos. El bonito debes pensar y bonito debes hacer. Y ojalá esto pase en Bogotá Fashion Week. Por eso convocamos estas palabras, ¿no, María Paz?
Yo también te voy a decir, Joina. Rocío dijo que así te decían en la casa. Y quiero que sepas que esta es tu casa el día de hoy. Nos honra profundamente que estés acá. Yo también estoy emotiva.
Vamos a tener que pedir a alguien del público que se anime a leer el último poema.
Que los...
Miren, sería muy bonito. Voy a invitar a Ana María Fríes, que nos está acompañando aquí, que conoce también muy bien a Hugo Jamioy, a ver si nos acompaña con la lectura del último poema. Y Ana María también ha visto crecer a Joina.
Yo trataré, porque igualmente conmovida estoy y tengo que decir que hace 10 años, en un encuentro de saberes, Hugo Jamioy hace un saludo al público y nos saluda en su lengua natal y hace esa linda invitación y la presentación de lo que significa ser artesano. Desde hace 10 años ese poema se volvió mi lema de vida, mi lema profesional y mi lema personal. Piensa bonito, habla bonito, deje bonito. Gracias por compartir. Voy a tratar de no llorar. Uy, qué cosa más bella. Si no comes nada. Mi abuela iba diciendo, si esta noche comes maíz blanco, mañana las nubes serán tu compañía. Si comes maíz amarillo, el sol te hará sombra. Si no comes nada, el día no tendrá color. Muchas gracias.
Un aplauso principalmente para Joina, aquí, para Hugo Jamioy, para toda la comunidad que seguramente nos están viendo desde la sierra, que desde muy temprano esta mañana mandaron para el Bogotá Fashion Week toda la energía, como dice tu papá, ¿no? Dice, mandar la energía espiritual de la Madre Sierra. la recibimos aquí y queda espolvoreada aquí encima de todos. Vamos a dar ya inicio. Muchas gracias, Juina. Aquí vas a tener oportunidad además de encontrarte con profesionales del diseño. Seguro hay muchas Juinas entre el público durante estos días. Estudiantes jóvenes que le están aportando a desde el diseño convertirse en lo que sueñan ser. ¿Cómo te ves en el futuro? Porque aquí hablamos de futuro y con eso terminamos.
Bueno, desde hace muchos años, cuando mi papá me compró, pues sin tener idea de que iba a ser yo quien iba a empezar como a coser y experimentar como en el diseño, venimos construyendo como esa idea de tal vez como transmitir un poco de ambos pueblos a través de otro como conductor que vendría siendo la moda, pero de una forma bonita y claramente con muchísimo sentido y muchísimo valor, ya que detrás de cada símbolo, cada tejido, cada puntada, cada color, hay toda una cultura, 2 culturas detrás. Y pues sí, en verdad, en 5 años me veo contagiando a más personas de este sentir tan bonito y de esa reconexión también con la madre tierra y con la sierra, el corazón del mundo.
Muchísimas gracias. María Paz, también te dejo que muchas ocupaciones. Esto comenzó. Juina, un abrazo. Y ahora sí, la despedimos ambas con un aplauso y continuamos con la conversación. Gracias. Pueden seguir. Hello, Sass. Good morning. So, we have a very special conversation to share with Sass Brown. Thank you for your patience. The opening was planned to be at 11:45. This is not a Colombian excuse. This is just the way things happen when they start, and you are an expert on make things happening, huge things. How do you feel and how do you manage your nerves when you're planning something and you're late or something goes wrong or Murphy is there? Perdón, el micrófono. No, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and I am so grateful to be here. I wish I could do this in Spanish because it is such a more it's such a more beautiful language, I think, than English, and is so much more explanatory. But hopefully, everything I say will get across fair enough. But how do I deal with? Oh, I guess over the years, so much has changed and so much has happened. I've more or less learned how to go with the flow, that some of the best things happen that you don't expect. And if you can take advantage of those, all the better. So you can't plan. They are what they are.
Good advice. Thank you very much. We need to hear that. I want to thank Sass Brown publicly because when we asked her to come to Bogota Fashion Week, she didn't hesitate. Sometimes people from abroad, when you invite them to Colombia for different reasons, maybe they ask, Colombia? You didn't say Colombia. You just said yes, a beautiful yes. This is not this is not your first time in Colombia, but it's the first time you're on stage in front of the public. So for us, it's a pleasure to have Sass Brown sharing all her knowledge here. Thank you very much.
I'm honored to be here, and of course, why would I not accept an opportunity to be in this beautiful country, and to participate in your Fashion Week? I'm honored. Thank you.
And you're here because you're one of the most meaningful persons in fashion global industry that has shown us the way since almost 20 years ago, when fast fashion was revealing all the consequences. Sass Brown, who first was a designer, must say, and then become a journalist, an investigator, a researcher, an academic. And you almost practically invented the slow fashion. Can we talk about that?
Gosh, I don't know if I can quite take credit for the entire movement, but yes, I was there at the early inception of what we call sustainable and ethical fashion. Absolutely. It didn't even really have a name back then. And I was just lucky enough to have traveled enough and to know enough about what really groundbreaking work designers were doing around the world that people weren't talking about where I was at that time in New York. Now I'm based in London. And so many designers were doing really incredible work, challenging a tradition and a system in fashion that is Eurocentric by default. And we're challenging that system with new ways of doing, new ways of designing, new materials, new ways of thinking. And it wasn't being talked about outside of the local parameters that it was being practiced. And so many designers and many practitioners, many artisans, many makers were feeling very much isolated, that they were working and challenging this system on their own. When the reality was there was a myriad of people around the world doing it, but there were very few connections between them and very little discussion about connecting these incredible hotspots from Valparaiso to Bogota to Nottingham Trent to New York to etc. And so that was why I started writing.
Sass wrote a first book, a great book. It's called Eco Fashion. And therefore, your website, ecofashiontalk.com, that first thing I asked Sass when I met her was like, Sass, why you stop that website? We really need to keep reading ecofashiontalk.com. Why did you stop that?
Oh gosh, it seems like so long ago now. I started it initially because I launched it at the same time as my book, Eco Fashion, and that was quite specifically about connecting all of this amazing design work, process work, making that designers were doing around the world that was challenging this system. And so the website was an outgrowth of that, and a much more immediate one where I could share many more examples than I could put into the book. I started it because nobody was doing it, but I stopped it because I felt that there was enough other voices and enough other conversations going on that it didn't necessitate my voice any longer. So that's why it started, and that's also why it ended. It's been archived now since I think 2017 or something like that.
Yes.
It still lives, although it's a bit clunky now because it hasn't been updated for a very long time. But yeah.
But we have the book, Eco Fashion, and then we have Refashion. I keep reading this book over and over again, Sass, because as you have said, you're connecting dots since the beginning. I want to ask you about how you plan this book, because what you bring us in this Refashion is a selection of people that are doing the right things. What was the plan and the methodology on the book?
The plan really was to give a very global spread of the work that was being done around the world, so it wasn't Eurocentric by default, despite at the time, I guess I was still in New York when I published it. And so thankfully it was also translated into several other languages, Spanish of which was one. So I wanted to ensure that there was a real spread. So it was just looking, refashion specifically was about designers that were working with upcycled, recycled materials, whether they were pre-consumer or post-consumer. So whether they were unwanted garments or unwanted leftover materials from production. And it was to show a myriad of different creative uses that utilized what previously people had just considered waste, just part of the system. That, you know, fashion is production, cutting garments is a detractive system by default. You have a length of fabric, you place your patterns on it, you cut out the pieces you want, you detract them, and you throw away the rest. And so it's a very wasteful system. And by default, those materials can be a resource for another creator, but they hadn't previously been really considered in any strategic way. So I wanted to show examples of designers and makers around the world that were using the offcuts, the leftovers, the unwanted garments, and making incredibly beautiful things from them.
And precisely, this is what we bring, what brings us together in this conversation, because this is all about ethics. And when we talk about the actual global fashion system, when we talk about Colombian fashion, when we try to think what's gonna be our future, we have to talk about waste from an ethical point of view. And thank you, Sass, for maybe have thought the frame of the ethics. Here we have some pictures about what you were talking about. How do you like to define waste? Definition of waste.
I mean, traditionally, it's been what is undervalued or devalued or completely worthless, whether it's offcuts or leftovers or unwanted or no longer wanted parts of production, or at the end of a life cycle of a garment when an individual no longer wants it. But the challenge is, how do you recontextualize things that we've traditionally seen as worthless as actually a resource to produce new things from, to reuse, to revalue, to redesign?
We can go to the next picture, because this was environmental impact of materials. Are we gonna live like in a huge waste basket at the end of the world? What do you think?
I certainly hope not. I mean, the scale of waste through fashion is incredible. It's huge, from the sourcing of fiber, whether it's synthetic, whether it's natural, all the way through the process of sampling, of dyeing, all of the wet processing, finishing, garment production, and then consumption and discarding of consumption. The scale of it is huge. So we have many issues to deal with. But we have to. Part of the concept of circularity is recontextualizing that waste as having a value and ensuring that it stays within our production process, our consumption, for the longer term.
In fact, we have in our mannequin this apron made out of remanufactured denim. It was sewn by people, imprisoned people in the prison of Picaleña here in Colombia. I asked the designer Alejandro Crocker, who is a pioneer, showing us also the way of the remanufacturing, the textiles. And he went to Picaleña prison to make a special training process for this imprisoned man there. So they could make these aprons for Bogota Fashion Week for our crew of SillaVerde. And then they come back to Bogota, and they were sued by the migrants, women migrants from Venezuela that live here in Bogota. And yes, a little apron makes you think about the future. A very tiny piece of waste should make us ask ourselves about our ethics. Isn't that?
Absolutely. I mean, the challenge that we have is that fashion, particularly in the mass market and in fast fashion, has become so devalued. When you can buy a top for the same amount as you can buy a cappuccino or a frappuccino, then it has about as much value, and it's discarded with about as much lack of consideration. Fashion has become disposable. And that is a major problem in terms of environmental impact and human impact. One of the problems that we have within the fashion system is that we've forgotten that design by default is an opportunity to resolve problems. Design by default is intended to answer a question, a problem, and fashion has become about consumption and not about problem solving, and that in itself is a problem. We need to remember that fashion can solve problems, not just make problems. I mean, the example that you gave about the aprons being, first of all, made from wasted materials that would otherwise either have been incinerated, ended up in landfill, or shipped off to a country that probably has no ability to recycle it, because nowhere has any ability to recycle the scale of waste that we produce. So it's an opportunity to revalue all of the effort that went into producing those materials and that product in the first place. It has an energy footprint. It has many people that have participated in its manufacture, and then to actually manufacture it with the community that benefits from that support and that employment is so twofold. So you are impacting both the challenge and the problem we have with waste, as well as the problem that we have manufactured within our production system of devaluing the hands that actually produce our clothing.
One of the major problems is also related to how political decisions are being made in all countries that produce most of these fast fashion or consume fast fashion, that go to Africa, for example. I want to talk about Africa because you know very well Africa. Maybe also Sass Brown has been the woman that, when nobody was just paying attention to Africa, what was going on there, she paid a lot of attention in both ways: positive effects on the great designers, new designers, emerging designers, and the bad effects that becoming like maybe a huge waste basket for the world.
Yeah, we have, again, back to waste, we have this incredible scale of unwanted garments from the West. Our level of consumption is so out of control, and we have no mechanisms to deal with it. So the answer is to ship it off to countries that have even less ability to deal with that scale of waste, whether that is Accra in Ghana, whether it's the Atacama Desert in Chile, whether it is number of different geographies. And unfortunately, that's tied to trade agreements. So a number of years ago, we had, there were several African countries, Uganda, I don't recall all of the countries off the top of my head, that actually proposed banning Western imports of unwanted garments. But unfortunately, they were effectively talked out of that negotiation because of trade agreements. Politics has an enormous power here to say, well, if you won't accept our wasted garments and deal with them, then we won't allow your exports to us. So unfortunately, it becomes a political negotiation, trade agreements between countries, and everyone backed down except Uganda. Actually, Uganda did ban the export of, or the import to them of unwanted garments, because it has an incredible impact on their environment, the leaching of chemicals into the water table, into the soil, the dangers of disintegrating clothing, the chemicals that come out of that, the dangers of fire. It hasn't, and just the pollution, the general wastage of garments spread across a desert or in a marketplace that are unwanted, even though they're exported.
Mm-hmm. Bad politics and wrong practices in the fashion global industry and waste, I guess, have given you great ideas. Can we talk about the ethical fashion initiative in this way? I mean, you found a solution for that also.
Well, there are some fantastic initiatives that have developed in terms of dealing with the many problems that we have in fashion. The All Collective out of Accra in Ghana, for example, which is drawing attention to the scale of waste that the West exports to Ghana and the enormous human and environmental problems that engenders. There have been many organizations. You referenced the Ethical Fashion Initiative, which is part of the United Nations. It's a flagship program of the ITC, the International Trade Center, and headed and founded by Simone Cipriani, who are now based in Kenya. Who work with artisan communities and connecting both the formal and the informal maker, designer and artisan communities with Western markets in a long-term, sustainable, fair trade, fairly paid initiatives, and do fantastic work.
Well, I think everybody maybe this listening here is feeling something close to what I'm feeling, is that we need a lot of many Sass Browns in the world in order to try to connect everybody, every place, every country, all the fashion local industries, all companies, all sectors, to think in the same direction. Different ideas, same directions. Can we go to the next slide, please, Valeria? Because I want to keep talking with Sass about the STEAM challenge that you have also developed. No, the Energizing Futures Ultimate STEM Challenge, because that has to do with the circular economy that really is very important for the matter of the development of the industry here in Colombia also.
Sure. I mean, the concept of circularity generally is important, I think, in every industry now, that we cannot maintain a linear production system. Doesn't matter if we're producing tables or clothing. We can't continue to consume the raw materials that are used to produce our clothing and to consume and discard our clothing in the same way. I mean, I don't know how long ago it was that Cradle to Cradle stated we needed 5 planets to continue our consumption at the scale of growth that we utilized. That it's not a feasible long-term plan. The entire concept of business generally and how we value success, how we state somebody is doing well is by global proliferation. They're producing more, they're selling more, and therefore there is more being consumed and more being discarded. And we don't have the ability to deal with this. So we must connect those two ends, from concept to discarding, and make it a circular economy, so that the end of the life of one garment or one material becomes the raw materials to make another. And there are a myriad of different ways that can be done, through fiber reclamation, through upcycling, through redesign. So absolutely, there are many systems to work with there.
This is the moment that we have to talk about the people. People that consume, people who design, people who produce, people who consume and wear, and people who work. This is labor condition. And what about this? If not, would you say this is the most important ethical problem in this moment?
It probably is. I mean, we have a massive challenge, particularly with fast fashion and cheap fashion, mass marketed product, irrelevant whether it's fashionable or it's not fashionable, is problematic because it's built from what we call the bottom of the pyramid. It's built on producing faster and cheaper. And to do that, it by default must take advantage of people and planet. And so the people within our supply chain, the skilled hands that produce our materials, our fibers, our garments, are constantly negotiated down so that they can produce cheaper. And we do it in countries, most of the production of mass marketed clothing is done in countries where labor can be taken advantage of, whether because there are limited legal supports for them, or whether employment is so important that people can be taken advantage of. And that doesn't just happen in, the global south. We had our own big debacle in the UK just a couple of years ago with Pretty Little Things and Boohoo producing in Leicester in the middle of the UK, paying less than half of legal wage because they can. There are people who are desperate enough to work that they will take whatever opportunities are afforded them. And that's taking advantage of people. That's the reverse of ethics.
We are talking about a system of systematic abuse on the whole world. Sass Brown, can you listen to me? Is that okay? I mean, sound is good. ¿Me escuchan? Okay. When we talk about abuse and we think about the whole world map, from South America, from this corner of South America, which is Colombia, of course, we know in our fashion system also, we listen to the news, we know that what's going on maybe in Asia, disasters happening there, this thing with Africa, very complex thing. What's going on in Latin America? Can you tell us what's going on here in terms of labor condition?
Labor conditions in the fashion supply chain globally are abysmal. I mean, we have a complete lack of transparency in terms of how brands produce, where they produce, under what conditions. Most brands will make some statement about goals, about intent, but very, very few actually report back on what the outcome of those goals are. So something like Fashion Revolution's annual transparency index is really important because it showcases what little brands are doing in terms of actually sharing the information of where and how they produce. And other not-for-profits such as Labour Behind the Label, the Clean Clothes campaign, were not-for-profits that specifically focus on how garment workers are treated, how they are paid, and under what conditions they work in for the manufacture of our clothing and our textiles.
Mm-hmm. In terms of making like ethical decisions, would you say that consumers are more sensitive to educational campaigns, good information, or producers, designers? Who is the hardest to convince that this is not just important, this is urgent?
There are challenges with every level of consumption, I think. For anything to be completely successful in changing the way we do things, in changing our system of fashion, I think there are three main stakeholders. there is government, because there must be legislative control and legislative follow through. So not just a statement about this is illegal, but actual ramifications for breaking a law. There has to be the brands, the manufacturers have to buy in, have to align with those regulations that the government puts in place, and the consumers also have a part. I think quite often we put too much pressure on consumers to make the right choice when there are also governments and brands in this triangle of production and consumption. And yes, we can all make more ethical choices. We can all make more choices that have a better impact, a positive impact. But I think it's unfair to put all of that pressure onto a consumer when brands continue to overproduce, continue to produce things at a cost that is unfair to those that make the garments.
I'm asking this because Sass Brown has become also an academic, a teacher, no? Teaching mastermind. And she wrote and led the new master's program for Kingston's University London entitled Sustainable Fashion Businesses and Practices, which is your actual big project. Academy is the place to be in order to not make the pressure on consumers, but on the future professionals of the sustainable, hopefully, entrepreneurs.
I think we all have a role to play, whether you go through formal education in a university, whether you're a consumer, whether you're self-taught designer. I think we all have a role to play. We have a massive problem, and it will take many, many different perspectives, different people, different ways of doing things. Yes, I'm an academic and I teach both at the master's and the PhD level predominantly about different and alternative ways of using fashion as a positive influence in our world, of changing the system and the ways that we do things. So not necessarily just about design, it can be about systemic change. And so, yes, that's an important part of this decision, but it's not the only answer and it's not the only response. We all have a part to play in this.
Mm-hmm. Talking about overproduction, what would you say to the people, to us, seated here, sharing this great Bogota Fashion Week, which, by the way, BFW means...
It's British Fashion Week to me, yes. BFW's British Fashion Week.
I was thinking maybe when we asked Sass Brown to come and honor us to be here in Bogota Fashion Week, and we said BFW, maybe she thought, oh, these people from British Fashion Week, what they want, no? No, we are Bogota Fashion Week, but we are seated here. We have a great big store open to the public, 110 brands, Colombian brands here, and they want to sell. And we want to buy because there are beautiful, well-made things, very well thought also. How do we deal, both sides, in the middle of a Bogota Fashion Week with this concept of overproduction? Because we can do a lot of things anyway.
There are so many responses to that question, and I think part of it is simply consuming more consciously. And that takes time and it takes experience, When we're younger, we're a bit like kids in the candy store. And yes, there's wonderful things out there and there's fantastic clothes and there's new trends and we want to consume it all and be part of it because it's beautiful. That's what fashion offers to the world. But as we get a little older and we realize the cost of those things, there are many ways of consuming and supporting an industry, locally produced, locally sourced materials, design, production, reuse, recycle, upcycling designers, just investing in pieces that we love and that we want to hold on to and that we value. there are many ways of turning our consumption into something positive and not negative.
We host we society professionals from fashion system in Colombia host a movement, civic movement like back in the 70s, which is called Vístete de Colombia. What says the brand in the t-shirts, and one of the main goals is to make people think in this sense that you were talking about, that yes, we can make the difference. We can think together about probably the size of the businesses, how transparency works in our fashion system. Do you believe in this, kind of organizations that don't have like strictly a commercial goal, but in esprit? No?
Absolutely. No, I think it's absolutely vital. Again, I think there are many, many solutions, and it requires many solutions to solve the massive and diverse problems that we have in fashion production and consumption. And I think that, excuse me, the participation of community-based groups, of groups that, whether they are, there's in the UK we have a huge resurgence of maker cafes, which pop up in cafes around the UK, which you can bring your broken computer, your broken coffee maker, or your broken zipper, and people will help you repair, hold on to your clothing. These are important initiatives. They teach skills, they teach value, they do a lot of things. So absolutely, I think there's a place for all of this.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Sass, I'm so sorry, but time is so short, and we have all this program very exhausting. I would like to finish this conversation with you with the poems that Junia shared with us. I gave you the translation this morning, and I was worried it was too soon in the morning to do that, but Sass is a great reader. How many books you used to read, like by month?
Sadly gone down significantly since I wrote the new MA. I have very little time to read anymore. But yes, I did used to consume and try to continue to consume a lot of books.
We have a very nice bookstore here next to us with a coffee, so we invite them, all the public, afterwards to meet you there. But what about the poems? What do you think about this in terms of also ethics that we should have in countries like Colombia, with a past, with history, with communities, artisan communities, indigenous communities specifically?
Yeah, that's something we haven't really touched on so far, which is the traditions and the artisan communities that many countries still have relatively intact, something we've long since lost contact with it in the West. We don't really have any artisan traditions anymore in the UK or in a number of countries from the region that I'm in. And I think there is an incredible knowledge that we can learn from in indigenous cultures. When I read the poem this morning, and I'm sure it didn't nearly begin to do it justice in English, because Spanish is so much a richer language romantically than English is, I jotted down a few notes, so I'm just going to read what I wrote after I read it, which was that in many indigenous cultures of tradition, textiles are woven into the very fabric of who they are. They are how stories are told and traditions passed on from one generation to the next. They have a knowledge and a value that is intrinsic within them that we have long since forgotten in the West. And it is one way of healing our industry if collaborations are done respectfully between parties. I have an incredible respect for textiles globally, and for the artisans that produce them, many of which come from indigenous traditions. And I think that it's the loss of those traditions is not just a loss to the community themselves, but to all of us globally. that it is something that enriches us, but it is also something that, and I focus on this quite a bit in my own program, it's not something that's taught through fashion programs, how to collaborate, how to honor other people's traditions. Traditionally, fashion is taught how we steal, how we borrow, how we are inspired by, as opposed to how we honor, respect, and collaborate with the holders of those traditions. We have no right to just take from other people's traditions without equally giving back and without showcasing the values that we have learnt from them.
Would you say that social media, that has such a great responsibility of the perception on fashion, the ethical behavior that we must have, related with what you have said, what social media and keeping traditions and trends, how do you combine this dish, should say?
You can shape social media however you want it, right? I mean, it's up to you what you post. I think that it has an incredible power to reach people. And it was social media that predominantly started calling out brands like Carolina Herrera for cultural appropriation in Mexico, or any number of other, from Comme des Garçons to Louis Vuitton to, collections that were based on other people's cultures, that appropriated them, that didn't even take the time to name where those inspirations came from. Never mind, found ways of knowledge exchange instead of just a one way we're taking. So I think social media has played an enormous role, and hopefully will continue to call brands out when they make those errors in judgment, because that's traditionally how fashion has been conducted in the West. The world is full of beautiful people and beautiful places, beautiful traditions and textiles. And as designers in the West, we've traditionally been taught, it's your oyster, go pick out whatever you want to be inspired. And designers are not taught that they must give back. This must be an exchange, not a take. So that's one of the things I focus quite a lot on in my master's program.
Okay, let's keep that in mind. There is an exchange going on because ethics are everywhere. Thank you very much, Sass Brown, for being here. You're going to have a beautiful conversation on Friday with Barbara Velasco,
Yes.
which is the president of the World Craft Council Latin America, who is with us. She's also one of our very special guests. And hopefully we'll be there, these people, more people, in finishing these conversations, BFW, which is going to be British Fashion Week now.
I think from now on it'll be Bogota Fashion Week.
Okay, let's exchange that. Okay, thank you very much. Please honor Sass Brown. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Hay 15 minutos de intervalo antes de que inicie la siguiente conversación aquí y por supuesto en el auditorio número C, el C del piso número 2, y pasen por aquí con la librería Café Rico, disfruten y busquen los libros de Sass Brown que quizás ya han llegado. Gracias.